So we'll start off with Trevor Lawrence, then we're going to talk about Caleb Williams, then we'll talk about Joe Burrow, just because, the Bears and the Jags had a game today, so I think it's just logical to go in that order from T-Law to Caleb, even though Burrow came in between in terms of draft order. So for Trevor Lawrence, he's been an average to mediocre. Mediocre, sometimes it kind of gets used in the wrong context. That's kind of middle of the pack, and sometimes people use it as outright bad. No, T-Law's been a mediocre quarterback in the league, but he hasn't been an outright bad QB, aside from the first year. But we kind of excuse that because he had Urban Meyer as the head coach. And as we've seen, Meyer just kind of, the circumstances around that, he just wasn't the right fit and not a good NFL head coach. But for Trevor Lawrence, he's been just absurdly average as an NFL quarterback, and he just made a lot of money on a huge contract. And that's kind of seen as overpaid because he hasn't lived up to the expectation that was given to him as the best prospect since Andrew Luck. The Jags have had a ton of playoff success under T-Law, and his performances haven't always been the best. So for him, he hasn't had a star-making moment, right? But he hasn't been a bad quarterback. However, because of the fact that he was seen as a generational prospect, his performances is seen in a more negative light than a guy that was, undrafted and did the same stuff. T-Law adds the same amount of value to your football team as someone who put up the same production as him, but because he was seen as a generational prospect, then all of a sudden, he's seen as more of a disappointment, and that's not on him, right? I think the negative perception around Trevor Lawrence isn't all his fault. It's not his fault the media saw him as the guy that was going to turn the Jaguars around, because the Jaguars have not been an organization that is known to be well managed, right? So he was expected to come in and turn things around, and he hasn't necessarily done that. He's been a mediocre quarterback, and that's seen as really disappointing. But I think if Trevor Lawrence, if Trevor Lawrence was a 7th round pick and he was doing the same stuff, that he would be a great story. But he's not. And that's because of the fact that he was considered to be a generational prospect. And that alters our perception of them so much. And I think Lawrence is a prime example of that. He makes a ton of money. He's deemed overpaid because he's been average, but he makes that money because of his potential as a prospect. And so the perception of him goes down to how we viewed him back in college. And I think at some point we've just got to take a look at Lawrence. He's not that same generational prospect at this point. So we just have to take a look and judge him by how he plays in the NFL. And right now that's as an average QB. And that's okay. He still has a spot in the league. We don't need to call for his head. But at the same time, we also don't need to have sky-high expectations for him anymore. And that's okay. But it's time we move on from the generational prospect label for Trevor Lawrence.